Well, it's a privilege and an honor to have Carlee with us from Nutrisense in America, the CGM expert, continuous glucose monitors. And I've been so incredibly impressed with the technology and their app called the Nutrisense app that I've embraced Carlee and her team overseas in America, based just south of Seattle, I think, Carlee. And thank you for coming on the Made to Thrive show. And just appreciate your time, the work that you're doing, and just introduce yourself to the audience and to the viewers.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Like you mentioned, my name is Carlee, so I am the Lead Dietitian Nutritionist at Nutrisense. And like you mentioned, we're just this company that uses continuous glucose monitoring technology, and we're hoping to change the world. So we believe that this technology has the ability to prevent disease, optimize your metabolism, and just fine-tune your diet based on your own biology. So my role there is just kind of working with users and overseeing kind of that data. We've worked with thousands and thousands of users now. So we've probably seen more continuous glucose monitoring data for prevention and not just diabetes management than anyone else. So it's been a really, really exciting ride, and we love what we're doing.
Great. Tell us, what exactly is CGM for the listeners?
Yes. So a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, is exactly like it sounds. So it's monitoring your glucose 24/7 continuously. And I think when we think of glucose, we always think of diabetes. And so I know my mind always used to go to that little finger prick device that is painful and not convenient and not fun to do. So that finger prick device is just getting one measure at a time. So it's kind of like a snapshot of your glucose. A lot of times it's done while fasting, but continuous glucose monitors are measuring your glucose 24/7 all day long. So instead of just seeing that one shot in time, you're seeing more of like a time lapse of your glucose. I always like to think of this like Instagram, right? When you're looking at highlight reels, you're just seeing, bits and pieces of someone's day. With continuous glucose monitoring, you're seeing the whole picture. So you can see what your glucose is doing overnight and completely after your meals, which is virtually impossible from any other glucose monitoring technology. So it's really, really helpful for seeing how your metabolism is working, seeing how you're doing with your diet, and how your body's responding to stress, sleep, food, fasting, meal timing, exercise, all those different things.
Great. Now, why is sort of the level of glucose, or, we talk about HbA1c, 3-month glucose level, that has its limitations. We know that, and it's not as accurate as people have said it is in the past. But why is it so important to have, a stable glucose with not many spikes? I mean, people think it's about diabetes. Now, that's the paradigm and the thinking. And, can healthy people use this, and why is it important?
That's an awesome question. And I think that everyone should be monitoring their glucose, even if it's not from a CGM, at least some sort of metric other than their A1C and their fasting glucose at their doctor, because it tells us so much information. So when we think about glucose, I like to think of this as our other vital sign. So we measure, our blood pressure, we measure our weight, we measure all these other metrics, but we're really not doing anything to look inside of our body and see how our metabolic state is doing. And so that's where glucose comes in. It is literally telling you how your body is responding to your foods and all those different lifestyle factors that are going on in your life. So when we're looking at glucose, this can kind of serve as our early warning signs for when something might be kind of going astray with our metabolism. So glucose likes to stay in a very, very controlled range. And this, just like any other process in the body, is for homeostasis. So that's our body's main goal, is to kind of keep that calm, keep that homeostasis. And there's a certain range of glucose that it likes to stay within. And when glucose is going outside of that range, so whether our diet or any other habits that we have going on are pushing it either a little too high or even a little too low, that can be that early yellow flag that something is not going right and our body's having to overcorrect. So when we think about going outside of that glucose range, I like to think of our body like a car. And that's when, our body keeps this tight level of glucose all the time, just like a car keeps gas. We need some level of gas to work properly. And we work really hard to keep it in this range. So when it's going above that range, right, so high levels of glucose, that's like your car being pushed all the way down. That gas pedal is at the floor. You're revving it up as hard as you can. And maybe one time is not going to hurt that car, but over time, pressing that down repeatedly can cause a lot of damage and be really hard on the car. So
what should the level be, and what is high? Because you're talking high, and what should people be aiming for when it comes to glucose levels?
That's a really, really good question. When it comes to levels, there's a little bit of debate here. For our customers, what we try and keep glucose to is about 70 to 140 milligrams per deciliter, or 3.9 to 7.8 millimoles per liter. That's kind of the threshold that we found from the research that is the best for metabolic health. So we start to see greater risk for damage when we get above that upper threshold. There is a little bit of debate. Some people say it should be a little lower, but some people say it should be a little bit higher. But that's kind of the range that we recommend, because we start to see things have this trickle effect when we repeatedly get to that high glucose exposure above that level. And so that's where we want our glucose to be at all times. It's going to vary. The optimal range is going to vary depending on what your glucose is doing. So whether it's fasting glucose, we want that to be usually around 70 to 90 milligrams per deciliter. With postprandial glucose, that's where it's up to that 7.8 millimoles per liter is kind of the maximum. But we also want it to come back down really quickly. So within about 2 to 3 hours, we want to see it come back down to those pre-meal values. And then looking at all those pieces together, we're looking at glycemic variability. And this is probably arguably our most important metric for metabolic health. It's going to tell us the most about our cardiovascular risk and kind of how our metabolism and how our insulin sensitivity is doing throughout the day. And glycemic variability, when you think of it, it's just kind of those swings in glucose. So those highs, those lows, and kind of the degree, the fluctuation, the duration of those swings in glucose. So lower glycemic variability is better for our metabolic health. And that doesn't mean we have to have a straight line for glucose. I think a lot of people think any fluctuation is bad. And really, some fluctuation is normal, some fluctuation is healthy. But when we start to see those giant fluctuations, we can see really big short-term changes like energy crashes, mood crashes, hunger, right? Like feeling ravenously hungry or just not having control over hunger. And then over time, this can cause long-term damage. So we can have microvascular damage, oxidative damage, inflammation, and then ultimately insulin resistance and all of those metabolic disease states that stem from that. So it's crucial to monitor.
Great. So glycemic variability, is it the actual average or is it the area under the graph? So if you fluctuate significantly, you go up to say 8 millimoles per liter and then you drop down to 3, or is it better to have a 6.5 millimoles per liter, which is on the high side, but it doesn't have the fluctuations? I mean, is there a lot of nuances to this?
There's a lot of nuances here, and we monitor through our app through standard deviation. So that just kind of tells you the difference above that mean, right? And we want a couple things. So the first one is we don't want that glucose to go above that physiological level often. So the occasional spike is probably not going to hurt us, just like we talked about with the car. But when that's happening over and over and over again, that's when that damage can happen. So we want to look at that area under the curve, how much we're going up, but also how much we're staying up there. So if you think about area under the curve, that's exactly like it sounds. It's just that area under the glucose curve. And when we're looking at high spikes, the area under the curve can be just as similar as lower spikes that last for longer durations. So we're looking at those two factors. We want it to be moderate in its peak, so staying within that level, but we also don't want it to stay elevated for longer periods of time, because this tells us that our insulin is not responding appropriately and we're not bringing glucose back down like we should be.
Great. And what about the oral glucose tolerance test? Is that pretty much dead now that there's CGM?
Actually, no. I think oral glucose tolerance tests can be helpful. We have people test carbohydrates and different types of glucose on their own with their CGM. So there's really not a way to do a specific oral glucose tolerance test with your CGM, because you can't just buy glucose and consume it. But what we can do is test different carbohydrates in isolation without any other protein or fat or anything else with them to see how our glucose responds. And this is a really good proxy for your insulin sensitivity to carbohydrates in general. So a lot of times when we suspect maybe insulin insensitivity or a little bit of insulin resistance, we can plan some experiments to trial different types of carbs that are very, very dense in carbohydrates, specifically glucose, and see how our body responds. Are we spiking really high? Are we coming back down quickly? How is our body responding? And that tells us how our insulin is responding and how sensitive we are to those effects of insulin. So we still have people, if they want to go get an oral glucose tolerance test, that can tell us a lot because we can look for those optimal levels. We can look for how quick you're coming down. And we can also monitor fasting insulin to see how that's playing a role as well. Now, none of those are available on the CGM, right? We can't do an oral glucose tolerance test at home unless we are doing it with those other foods, like I mentioned. Sometimes we'll do it with like boiled potatoes or rice or honey just to see how that can affect our glucose. But we don't have a continuous insulin monitor at this time. Hopefully that will come later on, but this is probably the best thing we can do to monitor that.
Great. And I think it's more sort of clinically relevant to actually try real food and see what actually happens, because a lot more foods have fiber, some don't. You process foods differently. Reading Rob Wolf's book, Wired to Eat, so important to test the different carbohydrates and how you process them. Even the times that you eat these, where you eat them, if you're eating them indoors or outdoors, everything makes a difference. If you wake up early and your cortisol is really, really low or high, these things are crucial. So I think it's more important, and that's why I think the oral glucose tolerance test has its, days. I think these days are numbered because it's not a real view of real food. Even if people are having processed food in the morning and they're having, cereals and grains and that, it gives you an indication of what's happening to your glucose, and you can see, hang on, I have this cereal, it's filled with processed sort of preservatives and colorants and sugar, and this is what it's doing to my glucose. And tell us about how the glucose spike actually damages the cardiovascular system, or is sort of a propensity to cause chronic conditions like metabolic syndrome.
Oh, 100%. So when you think about those high spikes, and again, it's not, I don't ever want to scare anyone from, having a high spike once in a while, especially if you're experimenting and you're trying to see what foods work well for you and which ones don't. That's part of the experimentation process. But that repeated exposure, if it's happening multiple times a day because you are having those processed carbs, you're having processed grains, you're having liquid carbohydrates like juice or soda, that's going to cause that repeated exposure to those high glucose levels. And we start to see that over time, that repeated exposure, those consistent glucose excursions above that threshold can cause that oxidative damage. And the more oxidative damage that we have, the more our microvascular can get damaged. And this can ultimately lead to more insulin resistance. So I like to think of it as when you're having these high glucose levels, you are increasing your need for insulin. So over time and time again, this is going to cause what's called hyperinsulinemia, right? Too much insulin in the blood. And what happens then is that our cells can become resistant to insulin action. So I always think of it as the boy who cried wolf, right? We're having it over and over that we just stop listening. And when that happens, there can be a downstream effect that happens within our body. And when we think about insulin resistance, when we think about insulin in general, it is an anabolic hormone. So it builds, it stores, right? It's helping us build things. It's helping us store things. And what that does in our cells, because every single cell in our body has an insulin receptor, is that if we are becoming resistant to that action of insulin, glucose cannot get into the body, into the cells to be stored and used for future use. And when we see that, we can see different parts of the body become insulin resistant, and this can affect different areas of the body. So now insulin resistance is linked to dementia, Alzheimer's, migraine, mood, all these different things that we never thought that insulin was related to. So if you think about it this way, say that we are having these glucose excursions over and over and over again. So constant exposure to high glucose. Say that we're drinking soda 7 times a day, right? Which you and I are not doing that, but there are a lot of people out there that might be. What happens is our cells can become at full capacity. So they cannot accept any more glucose. So that glucose is going to stay inside the blood. And we see this a lot with, the high carb, like I mentioned, but also grazing patterns of eating. So if we're eating all the time and not allowing our body, our glucose and our insulin to reset in between meals, or if we're not exercising to clear that glucose out regularly, we can have this high glucose all the time. And so this can act as this double-edged sword, because on a large scale, these habits repeated over and over can cause excess body weight to be stored, because that glucose can't go anywhere. So it's converted to fat and stored in our adipose tissue. And then over time, the more body weight we have, the more insulin resistance we have, the more excess body weight we have. And this can stop the body from storing glucose efficiently. This can impair the body's ability to dispose of glucose in the muscle. So if you think about it, if glucose is not able to get into the muscle to be stored, we're going to have lower performance because we can't access that glucose to fuel our movements. And then again, we're going to store more calories as fats. A lot of times this is stored around the liver. A lot of times this is stored in our muscles. And this is called ectopic fat. And what this does is it releases these inflammatory mediators and kind of tells our body that we're in this low state of inflammation all the time. And what does that do? That causes us to produce more glucose. So it's this vicious cycle of more glucose, more insulin, more resistance, and more body weight, which can lead to the inability to get out of that routine. And not that excess body weight is the end all be all for health, but it can just make it a little bit more trickier to get out of.
Great, sure. There's a lot of insights there that we're going to have to unpack for the audience. But I do want to give my personal story, because I used to have a green smoothie in the morning filled with kale, filled with moringa, filled with spinach, filled with celery, and I thought it was incredible for my health until I had a CGM. And I realized that my glucose was spiking to 8-9 millimoles per liter. I realized that damage was causing significant, problems. I didn't feel good afterwards. I would get a little bit of a low as well. When I started adding some MCT oil or coconut oil or even 2 eggs, my glucose didn't spike at all. It went to 6 or 7. So tell us about, adding fats and 2 things that might be carbohydrate rich, like a green smoothie that has, proposed benefits. I know that we've got Dr. Paul Saladino, who's a huge CGM fan, talking about the carnivore diet, that you don't need any of these, nutrients coming from fiber and, from greens, and you don't need carbohydrates at all. But tell us a little bit about the use of protein and fats and what happens in the body with these carbohydrates.
That's a great point. And you are not the first person to tell me a similar story about a smoothie. I think when we think of health, we think of a green smoothie. That's where our mind automatically goes. But the way I like to think of carbohydrates, such as in a smoothie, is that they're like kindling on a fire. So if you've ever had a big bonfire, right, and you're throwing small little pieces of kindling on it, they burn almost as quickly as you put them on there. And that's exactly how carbohydrates react in our body, especially when they're blended and broken down, that fiber is broken down, such as in a smoothie. Those liquid carbohydrates are going to be processed a lot quicker, and therefore they're going to hit the blood sugar a lot quicker and usually come down a lot quicker as well, causing that energy crash. So you made a really, really good point about putting, MCT oil in there, or maybe even protein in there, because what happens is protein and fat are not digested as quickly. Carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth, right? So before we even swallow that carbohydrate, before we're even taking a drink of that smoothie, we are already breaking it down and digesting it. Protein and fat, not so much. It takes a little bit more work for our bodies to break down. And our bodies like to work. That's what they're built to do. So it's these convenience foods that have been taken down from their original form. They've been processed and manipulated. Those are the ones that can hit our bloodstream a little bit more quickly and cause a little bit more damage. So just like you mentioned, we can mitigate that by adding a little bit of protein, a little bit of fats, because that's going to slow down that digestion. And I don't know if you saw, there was a recent, well, not recent, I guess it was 2015, seems recent still, but a food order study in which, and this was done in people that had diabetes, but they reviewed the order in which you consumed your meals to see how it reflected in your glucose response. So what they found was, if you ate carbohydrates first, you had a higher peak glucose, a higher average glucose, and higher insulin response than if you just switched the order and had either protein or vegetables first. So just by switching the order and not having carbohydrates first, you can reduce your insulin response, you can reduce your glucose peak. So that's a really powerful way that people can change their glucose metabolism and optimize it without really doing a whole lot of anything, right? So it's awesome. It's cool to see. I've seen it happen in a lot of our users' data, and I think that's a really empowering finding that they can see.
Great. I had my fasting webinar today and I looked at a bit of the data. 70% of Americans, I think this is debatable, but the data shows that 70% are overweight, 40% are obese. 1 in 3 Americans, it's probably about 100 million people, are either pre-diabetic or diabetes. It seems like we're losing the battle. Tell me about Nutrisense, the CGM, your app, your coaches, how the process works, and how you're going to transform the world.
Yes, that's a great question. I do hear those statistics a lot, and they're really disheartening. But I think that's what drives what we do, and that's what makes us so passionate about this mission. And that's because this has the ability to change the world. And there's a couple different things that I think are really important. First of all, it's prevention, right? So accessing this information early on when you still have a big window to make some big changes. Diabetes, prediabetes, obesity, right? Even those take years, even decades to develop. So if we're catching these little red flags early, such as a spike from a smoothie, or for me, it was that longer postprandial response. I wasn't returning back to baseline quickly enough because I had too many carbohydrates in my meal. So accessing this information and seeing how your diet can affect your glucose early on is critical. But then I think the other thing that's really helpful, especially with the CGM, is that it's real-time feedback. I know that I've worked with a lot of people that didn't have this real-time feedback, and we were just monitoring, hemoglobin A1C or weight. And as you probably know from working with your own clients, those are slow metrics to move. So it's really hard because there's this disconnect between a really good decision, like making a good choice at dinner, and the outcome that you want, like optimal metabolic health or improved blood sugar, because you can't see it right away. Yeah. So with the CGM, you can see how that is affecting you in real time. So you can see how foods are affecting you, whether good or bad, and you can kind of reinforce those good decisions, or you can stray away from the foods that cause those higher values. So it's that immediate feedback, and that just keeps motivation going. That keeps you on track and keeps you motivated to keep making those changes. So those are the things that I think set CGMs apart. But with Nutrisense, what's really cool, and I do have some screenshots of data and stuff if you want to look through that too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what's really cool, and let me just share my screen here. So what we can see, and I took a screenshot of your data, so I hope that's okay.
Perfect.
Your data looks amazing. So not a lot of glycemic variability here. Yeah. But what you can see here is this tells you in real time. So this green stuff right here is your glucose data. So it's telling you all the time what your glucose is doing at any point in time. And what's really cool is that we have the ability to assess and interpret this data with our analytics. So here's your analytics from this same day. So this was the 27th. And you can see here that your glucose stayed within this really, really tightly controlled range. Great for homeostasis, right? Your body's doing awesome. But we can see those metrics. And when we have these outliers, so say you spiked up to 150, we would see this in your data, and we could assess what that stemmed from and talk about ways to optimize this. So the analytics that we're looking for are your time within range. So we're trying to keep in that tightly controlled range for at least 95% of the time, but ideally a little bit more than that. And then we've got our mean, so our average glucose, our median, which is kind of our average, but it eliminates those outliers. And then this is that standard deviation that we talked about that talks about your glycemic variability and the overall swings in your glucose.
Wow, that's incredible.
It's really cool. Yeah, you can monitor this every single day. And what's awesome is that as you start to make progress, you can click 7 days, 14 days, 30 days, and you can see your numbers start to improve, which in itself is very motivating. So,
it reminds me of Peter Drucker's sort of words, what can be measured can be managed. And it's incredible work that he's got in terms of just measuring things, because I think it's an internal driver when people can actually see it. I mean, I've learned I fast every single day almost. Do intermittent fasting. I generally never have more than 2 meals. Most days from Monday to Friday, I'm having 1 meal a day and doing the OMAD. That's with exercise, probably 6 or 7 days a week. And so to have a look at this and say, hang on, well, on my fasting days, when I fast dinner, my glucose at night is more stable. My heart rate goes down. My heart rate variability goes up. I've got better glucose disposal. So it's really, really cool to see how, it can be measured and how your habits, your lifestyle, whether it's stress or sleep or fasting or, whatever happens in your life, your glucose is almost like directly affected, not almost, probably is directly affected to all these factors.
Yes. And I think a lot of times we think that this is just glucose in food, because that's, probably one of the bigger factors, but there are 4 pillars of glucose. We've got food, and that includes the fasting, like you mentioned, and your meal timing, but also stress, which is equally as important, sleep, and movement. So exercise and just consistent movement throughout your day. So we can go through those as well, but
Absolutely. Let's go for it. Run us through that process.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing here. And then if we want to look at any of the meal analytics, I also have a video of that too. So just let me know.
Cool.
But yeah, when we're talking about glucose, we like to think of them as pillars. So we think of our metabolic health as something those pillars hold up. And each of them is equally important for holding that metabolic health and keeping it strong. So food, you had mentioned timing, and you're kind of on an OMAD schedule, and that works well for you, as evidenced by your data, right? And that's kind of cool from your glucose, is that we can establish the proper fasting and feeding regimen for you, because that differs for everyone. We all have very, very individual genetics, epigenetics, muscle mass that kind of controls our glucose storage space. So all those different factors, our microbiome, those influence how we're going to respond to fasting regimens, different foods, different meal timing, different portion sizes. So food is this giant pillar that we're looking at, but sleep, stress, and exercise and movement are equally as important. So I think probably the biggest one that we've seen, especially this year with everything that's going on, is stress. And this has just as big of an impact on your glucose as food. And that's because when we are stressed, that primary hormone that's involved is cortisol. And cortisol's main job is to increase our glucose production and increase our stored glucose. And this is inherently important if we're trying to evolve and stay alive in history, because it's going to help provide us with that fuel to move throughout the stressor. If we're getting chased by a lion, that's cortisol is going to help keep us going to escape that threat. But now we have modern stressors that don't necessarily go away. So this is happening all the time. And what we start to see is that the stress, whether it's at meal times or just all the time chronically from jobs, pandemics, elections, whatever it is, that can wreak havoc on our postprandial response, but also our fasting glucose and ultimately our glycemic variability. So managing stress, however that works for you, is crucial.
Great. Next pillar.
Yes. So sleep is another big one as well, which I know you're huge on sleep and circadian rhythm and following all of that, which we found to be, just critical. There's been a lot of studies that show that both sleep fragmentation and sleep insufficiency have equal detrimental effects on glucose. So whether you're getting a full night's sleep, so there was a study that showed that people that were getting 8 hours of sleep, but it was disrupted, so they weren't achieving that deep sleep, right? That could increase their glucose up to 40% that next day. So that's huge, right? And then the same thing with sleep insufficiency. So 4 hours of sleep versus 8, you can have marked increases in your postprandial and also your fasting glucose the next day. And then sleep is kind of bidirectional, because if you have high glucose, so say you're eating later at night with meals that are higher in carbohydrates, and you have that higher glucose before bed, that can cause you to have poor sleep. Yeah. This again is that vicious cycle that continues over time. So sleep is extremely important, making sure you're getting both sleep adequacy and good quality sleep. I love that you have the blue blockers. We've seen great success with those as well.
Yeah. And also, if we look at I use the Aura Ring, to measure my different sleep cycles, the REM sleep, deep sleep, and what I found out, if I don't give myself at least 4 to 5 hours post-eating, then it affects my deep sleep significantly. And it's a challenge to you, because we want to eat as a family. We only have one meal a day together as a family, the 4 of us. So we do want to have that social aspect. But the closer you eat to going to bed, the more it wrecks your sleep. and your glucose takes a long time to come down compared to if you give yourself, or in my case, 5-6 hours, or even if I'm already been fasting for 7-8 hours, my glucose is stable. My heart rate is at the lowest level. My average and mean heart rate is low. My heart rate variability between my sympathetic nervous system and my parasympathetic nervous system is optimized. So I know this now through testing the process with my ring, as well as doing my CGM, that the lower my glucose is and the more my body doesn't have to deal with, firstly, breaking down all the nutrients that I put in the body, plus absorbing them and then putting them in the correct place, I get better sleep and I get better glucose levels.
100%. And I think that brings us to another point, and that is our insulin sensitivity is linked very, very closely to our circadian rhythm. So you could have a meal at 7 p.m. and it would have a very different response than if you had that same meal at 12 p.m., right? Because the later the day it gets, the worse responses, the more dramatic rises, the higher peaks in glucose that we're going to see. And then coupled with, in the evening, we're usually a little bit more sedentary, so we're not clearing that glucose. We can have those higher fluctuations all night long. So eating with the sun is one of the big things that I recommend. It gets a little bit harder in the winter months, right? Because that's a pretty short window, but the closer we can get to that, usually the better responses we're going to get. And this is one of the few things that's universal. There's so many different variabilities with glucose, but your timing is one of the things that's pretty consistent from person to person.
It reminds me of the book, The Circadian Code by Dr. Sachin Panda. Fantastic book in terms of circadian rhythms and rhythmicity and how important that is in terms of exercise, in terms of doing an anaerobic type of exercise, aerobic when you eat, regarding sleep. So, we'll put those in the show notes for people to tap into. But what I want to sort of dig a bit deeper into is what happens with CGM when the insulin is really high, glucose is really high, you get a fatty pancreas that's developed. Do doctors incorporate CGM in their protocols? Is it growing in the sort of medical world? What do patients practically do out there? Where can they get help? And I know it's going to be a process with Nutrisense and a coach, but, what do people do?
So I think that right now it's very difficult to get a CGM, especially here in the States. It's very difficult, which is why we come in. It does require a prescription. And thankfully, we have some providers on our team that prescribe these CGMs to our users. So we have a lot of people that tell us, I went to my doctor, I tried to get a CGM, and they said, this is only for diabetes. But when you think about, again, that window for prevention, you can have some control when you have diabetes, but by then, a lot of the beta cells in the pancreas are already damaged. So you're minimizing the effect that you can have from these early changes. So it's difficult. And I think that the more we talk about this and the more that we talk about how powerful these devices are, the more readily available they'll be and the more doctors will use them for this purpose. But I think they're hesitant because they want to always be doing the right thing. They don't want to prescribe things off label. And I think that's probably where they're coming from. I don't think that it's malicious by any means, but I think there is this disconnect there, and we need to make better use of the technology that's available. So we hope that with more people talking about it, more people getting into this and taking control over their health, that will change very soon. We would love for all doctors to prescribe the CGMs, and then we could just provide that counseling aspect and kind of help users interpret that data. Because as you probably have seen in your data, or maybe your clients see in their data, it can be difficult to interpret right at first. And so seeing the whole picture can be challenging. We find that our app is really helpful because you can log everything. You can log your meals, your exercise, your sleep, your stress. And so you can see how all these moving pieces affect that one glucose day's worth of data. And that's really cool because you can start to do experiments. You can see what happens when you have carbs at this time, when you eat at this time, when you change up your fasting. So we think that that's going to be a big change in the world of CGMs. But hopefully they become more readily available in the future because they're one of the best things that we can do in the preventative health space.
Totally agree with you. I think maybe we're one up on you in South Africa. Yeah, you don't need a script to get a CGM, which is incredible. But to get reimbursed for that CGM, you do need a doctor's script, as far as I know. So I think it's going to be the way of the future. I had a podcast with Professor Tim Noakes, the low carbohydrate and high fat guru in South Africa, who's pioneered so much work. And he reckons CGM is the way of the future. It's personalized medicine. It's personalized audits and assessments where people can actually make practical changes real time. And I think that's the power and the value in terms of CGM. Tell us about your coaching and how you sort of coach and come alongside people. People need a lot of help and support, and the community that they surround themselves is very, very important to ensure that firstly that you educate them, and secondly that you empower them to take their control of their own health.
Yeah, so we have, like I said, about 6 dietitians on our team. And what we do is we monitor that data. So we help the user interpret it so that they can make those meaningful changes. So the big thing that we value is that we're never going to prescribe a diet. We're never going to tell you what to eat. We're just going to help use that data based on your own biology to help guide your food decisions. So we are not the food police. I think sometimes that's what the fear is. I can't ever have this food again, or I'm going to lose my healthy relationship with food. And that's really the opposite of what we're trying to go for. We're trying to build that mind-body connection so that people can notice when they're having these foods and they're having these spikes and these subsequent drops in glucose. This is why my energy is low. This is why all these subjective feelings I'm feeling are happening, and I have control over that. So we reach out usually every couple of days with our users. Some users want to kind of explore on their own, and we respect that, but some users that have maybe a bigger health goal, like lowering their fasting insulin or losing weight or maybe preventing prediabetes after that initial diagnosis, we work with them really closely to help optimize that data based on their own food preferences. So we have a lot of different types of diets that use our program. We have a lot of carnivore users. We have a lot of keto users, low carb, vegan. I mean, you name it. And we're never going to tell someone they shouldn't eat something. Maybe soda will say, let's stay away from that. Yeah. But we just help them find the best choices within their preferences that are going to suit their health goals. So observe and guide using data is kind of how I think about it. And we're using data over dogma. So long we've had nutrition, one size fits all plans where eat this amount of carbohydrates and eat this amount of fats. But what we're finding is it's extremely personable. We cannot prescribe a diet without seeing your individual data and seeing how your body responds. So using that information, we can help users achieve their goal in a way like never before. So it's really exciting and it's really powerful.
Well, I'm looking forward to partnering with Nutrisense because I think if you've got the data, it's far important than the dogma. If you've got the data, you can take action steps. Maybe you don't even change your nutritional plan, but you change your stress, you change your sleep, and you change your movement, and that has a huge impact and profound effect on your glucose levels. So that's incredible. And then you're accountable to a health coach who can guide you, that you can tap into. I think a brilliant business model. And so well done to Nutrisense. And I'm excited about the future because I think it is a world-changing, combination. It's not leaving the person out there in the lurch, fending for themselves, and they go back to their medical doctors and the doctor says, listen, this is a waste of time. Not sure why you tried it. You're partnering with people. I do want to find out about your personal sort of nutritional plan. What does the amazing Carlee Hayes, do with regards to nutrition? I think our audience would want to know.
So I would say I eat a very mixed macronutrient diet. I probably lean more towards the higher fat approach, but I do incorporate plenty of carbohydrates that work for my body. So I found a couple things with my own CGM data, and that's too many carbohydrates at once leads to longer postprandial responses. And also certain fruits I do not respond well to. So any tropical fruit, I'm going to have these higher spikes in glucose. And that usually comes with a quick crash in glucose. So I try and kind of avoid those really high glycemic fruits. And I try to always start my day with a good source of protein. We are much more sensitive to carbohydrates on an empty stomach or after fasting. You've probably seen that in your own data. If you've ever done an extended fast, that's where we usually see the higher spikes in glucose, because after so long without food, without carbohydrates, we're going to have higher, more dramatic responses. So in my own data, I found that starting the day with, and when I say starting the day, I say at about 12 p.m., I kind of follow this 7 to 8 hour intermittent fasting window. I usually start with a good source of protein and a small amount of starchy carbohydrates. I found that sweet potatoes work well for me. They do not work well for my colleague, Kara. And it's really interesting because we're the same kind of age, height, weight, activity level, and that's a generally healthful food, but we were having very different responses to those. So my diet, I would say, is a little bit more leaning on the protein, but I incorporate those carbs that do well for me, about 2 meals a day.
Great. Sounds good. Tell me about the future of CGM. I mean, what's happening with the technology? I'm using the Freestyle Libre. I've got it on now, and I've scanned myself throughout the day. Tell me where it's going and what do you see?
So I think that hopefully my hope for CGM technology is that it's going to become more available, more affordable for everyone. I think as the technology gets a little less new, it's going to become a little bit more affordable to purchase. And that way this could be available to more and more people and change more and more lives. I would love to see the day where we have continuous ketone monitors and continuous glucose monitors, continuous insulin monitors. That might be just a little while, but I know that it's in the works. So I think that's the future, and that will help us kind of identify where our fuel source is coming from at all times. And from an athletic perspective, that's extremely powerful. So that's where I see it going. I see it becoming a household name and something that everyone does at least for a short amount of time every single year to make sure they're staying on track and focusing on that preventative health.
Incredible. I had a lot of queries after my fasting webinar about CGM because I spoke about it, the Freestyle Libre, and how you can incorporate it just to understand fasting, what it does to your glucose, what it does to your glucose disposal, what it does to your sleep, measuring your sleep. So we're going to hopefully get that to the different clients that have asked for CGM, and then we need to partner with someone to help us just understand the data, get our health coaches really up to speed with regards to training. So we look forward to the partnership with Nutrisense. And so thank you so much. My last question that I ask all my guests is sustained transformation and sustaining life habits is probably one of the most difficult things. I think the research shows that 80 to 95% of people that lose weight or regain that weight within 3 months, or even put more weight on after a 5-year period. Tell me what you think the most 3 important internal drivers are with regards to maintaining your sustained transformation.
It's an excellent question. I think the big thing that I always think of is removing the word diet from your vocabulary and replacing it with sustainable lifestyle. So I have a lot of people that will come to me with high aspirations of following a certain diet plan that's very, very restrictive. And while this might work for a short period of time, inevitably, when you go back to a quote unquote normal way of eating, you're going to gain that weight back and probably a little bit more. What happens when this happens is that we're losing so much of our muscle mass, and the more muscle mass we lose, the lower our metabolic rate goes. So slow, sustainable weight loss, avoiding any restrictive diets that you cannot follow long-term. If fasting works for you long-term, that's an excellent solution. If this is not going to work for you, then maybe we can explore some different options. Same with any specific diet, eating style, following something that works for your lifestyle, that works for your family, and you're not feeling restricted. I think that is huge. We always want to support a really healthy relationship with food. So doing and kind of incorporating optimal health, optimal metabolic health, but also enjoyment in your lifestyle. So work with someone that can help you find that balance, because it's kind of hard to see from your own personal state. And then monitor. If you don't monitor, you do not know. You don't have to use a CGM every single day for the rest of your life, but some sort of metrics that's going to give you that immediate feedback to reinforce those healthy behaviors. Because as time goes on, that's the thing that's going to keep driving you, is that reminder of your good decisions and the unfortunate reminder of your not so good decisions.
Great. I think there's a lot of value there. Thank you so much, Carlee Hayes from Nutrisense. What a privilege, what a pleasure. I really value your time, your expertise. I think you guys are an incredible wicket. I think you're going to grow immensely, and hopefully we can be your Southern African partners. To the audience, we'll be putting the show notes in place and hopefully partnering with this incredible company that has got an incredible testimony from many doctors out there, one of them being Dr. Paul Saladino, that hopefully we can get onto the podcast with the carnivore diet. He spent, I think, over 2 hours with Carlee's colleague, Kara, and they looked at his data and what happened when he had honey and what happened when he was on the carnivore diet. So we'll link that to the show notes as well. Thank you so much. And always remember, From SteveStavs, be and stay surrounded.